Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katiethornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. All right, welcome back to our next episode, Time After Time, Building Systems That Establish Confidence. Hey, before we get started, if you've been enjoying listening to the podcast, we really appreciate you giving us just a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to. So that helps us out, helps us keep the conversation going, helps get the word out there to people. And we just really appreciate it. So if you'd be willing to do that, we'd love that. Time After Time, Building Systems That Establish Confidence. Katie, we hear a lot about systems that need to be put in place, or we hear a lot about things as we talk to different educators all over the place that we realize really there's like a systematic problem, right? Like we're missing some good solid systems. We're gonna have a systems counter. How many times I say systems during this episode? But we're missing some good systems that are in place that actually, once they're up and running, would solve a lot of problems, or at least give us an avenue to have problems solved quickly, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think what we hear a lot as we get feedback from people, or we were out in the communities talking with people, is just a lot of times when we hear about behavior problems and those kind of things, what we end up really coming to the core of it is there isn't just a solid system in place. Because once you do have a system established, then you establish confidence that things are going to be handled.
Yeah.
For the most part, right? So as we're talking about being steady and having those systems in place that do provide confidence, it's really the comfort of the predictability. Like I think that's all we talk about. Good relationship practices, steady, predictable. So systems provide that, and that it happens. So when we hear that, with the reactions of people mostly feel unsettled when we don't have those things in place. We kind of lived by the philosophy, if it needs to feel like the adults have it, right? I think we say that a lot. So when we have systems in place, then the adults feel like they know what to do because we default to the system.
Sure.
And all it really comes down to the systems of response that are developed through professional development and open communication. So you can't just I can't just hand somebody the system that we have in place at school. It wouldn't make a lot of sense because we've done different professional development that would lean on that. We've had to adjust our system every year based upon the staffing and the kids' needs. You have to outline who you have involved in those systems and those kind of things. So it doesn't make sense because my staff's not going to look the same as somebody else's staff, and our needs are not going to be the same as another building's needs. But there's some systematic things that you could put in place that will help build confidence for your building as you're thinking about leading some trauma-informed work and reforming some behavioral practices.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I hear you talk about a lot too, as far as like a building as a whole, is that you'll get asked that a lot by various, principals and things like that. Like, what is it that you guys do, or what is your system? And I think what's difficult is, like you're saying, it's not just on paper, do X, Y, Z. It's the several years worth of training in professional development and kind of front loading and working all those things through, explaining why this is the system to staff and things like that. All of that also has to happen, as opposed to just having, hey, here's what you do. I mean, if that were the case, we would just put that in a book somewhere and sell it, right? Like, hey, this is the system. Go do that, which I think some people try to do, and that's why a lot of times those kind of, hey, I just want to buy your system, kind of fall flat, is because there's not necessarily the training and everything.
People have to understand why we're taking, why we're asking maybe the classroom teacher to go out and regulate with a kid. Why would we do that instead of coming in and just taking the kid? Yeah. What is the philosophy or the rationale or the science behind that? Why would we ask a kid to go for a walk? Why would we have a reset area set up? What is some of our tier 1 practices that are set up? How do we even just like real specific, getting down to like a student's response team, and how do we, I think we talk about it in, I think it's maybe episode 11, where we start talking about responding to kids in crisis. But like having a student response team, like how to use the radios, and it could, who responds, make sure you don't over respond to problems. We talk through, those are all, that's like a more tier 3 level of system. But if you start thinking about behavior and leveling out the tier 1 approach that you expect everybody to have and PD that really solid, then you start putting in those tier 2 systems that need to be put in place. So when behavior does happen, it does need to be managed. You have a framework to work off of and expectations and common language, and then you can go into more of the extreme tier 3 level of needs.
Yeah, and I've been at a place, I'm sure a lot of people have been at a place before where it seemed like the organization tried to do the opposite direction. They tried to like implement like a system and be like, and they were like, this is what we're going to do. And then we're trying to explain it after the fact. And not that there's not good learning that still ultimately can happen, but my gosh, like there's like a lot more pushback and a lot less understanding and so then even if it is a solid system that's being put in place and solid plans that are being laid out there that people are supposed to follow and things like that, what happens is they get implemented incorrectly by various individuals, not because those people are dumb or anything like that, but it's because it hasn't been explained and the whys behind it haven't been explained. And then what starts happening, right, is people start saying, well, this doesn't work. See, this doesn't work at all. And so then they want to throw everything out when in reality, maybe the end result could have been good, but we started by handing people what we wanted the end result to be without any explanation. And I think that's very difficult too. That's difficult for people on the receiving end.
Well, let's talk about, you think about everything we do, teaching, whether you're teaching adults or kids, that goes back to what are you doing with people? It's like you're establishing classroom routines and norms. We're doing that with our kids so they understand, have buy-in. They understand, so it's a community, collective idea. Same thing, we're putting systems in place. We're creating basically classroom, rules or norms, right?
Yeah.
But if we just do it to people, if we're looking at the social discipline window, we're doing it to people, then it's not really bought in and received well. So if we do it with them and take feedback and ideas and make adjustments, and ultimately your system will be stronger and better because you have some collective effort and from different people's perspectives. We all serve different roles in that system. And if you can walk alongside people and hang in there and have things in draft form and really talk through and start establishing a base team to start creating some of this and really look at your district's resources and the belief statements and what you expect out of tier 1 practices, and start building upon what your intervention systems could look like for behavior, then you can start establishing some of those things.
Yeah. And that, like you said, that leads to that steadiness, right? Yeah. Which is just wildly important. I think when we're steady, that trickles down to the kids, right? And like you said, and I think that's what people are looking for. That's also what, adults are looking for. All of us are just looking for something to feel steady and feel consistent. And I think that's what leads to that, is that understanding, that buy-in, and everybody getting the system as it's being built with an end goal in mind. Okay, so what's really the difference then between having like systems in place and having kind of a zero tolerance policy? Or like what people so often want is like a flow chart, right? They're like, we want a flow chart of like, if this happens, then we do this. If this happens, we do this. What's the difference?
Yeah, zero tolerance policies. I think if you aren't aware of those or didn't grow up during that era or uninformed about that, I would encourage you to just Google zero tolerance policy, and you will find zero research articles or data that says, you know what, that was a great idea.
Yeah, sure.
I think all the research is out there, very, very clear that is actually, it increases, it's a school to prison pipeline. We're actually having really good kids be suspended for bringing in a knife to cut an apple at lunch, right?
Yeah.
We're having kids being expelled for things that we just know too much about the brain and how humans work, that we really have to frame it through the MTSS lens that behavior requires intervention.
Yeah.
And that's really what the law requires us to do. So there's not going to be like, if you push a kid in the hallway, you are suspended for 4 days. That should never be the system in your school.
And I'll say, like, before you keep going, like it's hard to not do that. Because it's even hard, no matter who you are, to be like, well, this kid maybe punched a kid, right? And so they're going to be suspended or whatever. And then another kid punches a kid. Well, like your mind automatically goes to like, well, they have to be suspended too. Yeah. Right. So it's hard. It is hard to not fall into that.
Yeah. You got to figure out where your line is too. And even like the minor things, like is our system can't be sending kids up to the office all the time, right?
Sure.
Because we've talked through that even, just about why there's so many practices put in place, but we've got to work through some of those things with kids and really look at that tier 1 practice. But really, it's looking through the legal guidelines of MTSS, and when we know kids need intervention, behavior included, we have to put systems in place and to collect data. And then we have to look at their needs holistically and then develop those intervention plans. And then we also have systems that support the neuroscience and regulation. We have to regulate kids before we reason. We often are quick to get caught up in that moment of dysregulated kid, dysregulated adult, and making really rash, consequential decisions based upon that, or responding really. How many times do we see people respond really big?
Sure. Yeah.
That they feel overwhelmed, or they don't feel like they have the capacity to take this on, and instead of I think the sweet spot, and which I'm super proud of, the team we have, everybody responds very calmly all the time, everyone, and I think that really helps. But when you have somebody that over responds, or makes the system really difficult, because you're trying to sift through that with a dysregulated kid and a dysregulated adult.
Yeah.
But your system always should be really at the heart of it. We should be problem solving with kids, and
Sure.
there's going to be things that come up with. So we talk more about discipline and school consequences. What I really encourage people to do is set up that tiered framework. What are our practices for tier 1? What is we're going to collect data? What does intervention, research based intervention look like at tier 2? And then what are some of our kids with some greater needs that we need to put some crisis plans or some systems in place, and it needs to be in the framework of that tiered intervention system, which is different than talking about punishment and consequences, right?
Sure.
So zero tolerance really talks about punishment and consequences, and so then it's not intervention based. It's this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've just kept thinking that, again, flowcharts are built on if this, then that kind of approaches. And that just disregards all the individual circumstances, all of the whys behind any kind of action. And it ultimately doesn't really solve most problems. It just kind of displaces it for a bit, typically speaking. But having kind of different approaches ultimately places an importance back on empathy. And I think any kind of flowcharty kind of zero tolerance kind of thing, it takes empathy out of the equation. Remember, and it's like that ability to understand the circumstances of somebody else, put yourself in their shoes, and take them into account. And so when we use those flowchart kind of systems, all of a sudden we have no empathy, because we're just going straight to this flowchart. And it's which we know now, where even we've got curriculum that's mandated that we teach, where part of it is teaching students empathy. We should also be kind of modeling that. But then the flowchart ultimately, or that kind of system still ultimately, initially I feel like is like a lot of people want that. But then if you dig a little deeper, what you realize is using a system like that really strips the classroom teachers of almost any of their power to make decisions, because they just have to become almost like robotic managers of sorts, as opposed to people that are in relationship with a kid and have the ability to choose and make decisions and more thoroughly understand, right? And so having a different kind of approach just empowers any classroom teacher, any educator, to make decisions that are actually best for the student based on their knowledge of the student. Because the further away you get from the person that works with the student the most, the more naturally, the more impersonal, I guess, the decision making is going to be.
Relationship
right?
there.
Yeah. So the person who's best to make the decision, now again, wait till you're calm, you're regulated, whatever, seek out advice by all means. But the person who's really best suited to come up with what should happen after a situation or with a situation is the person that's closest to the student. So I think it's actually but that idea is really intimidating to educators at first, I think, especially the ones that are used to kind of using a flowchartish kind of zero tolerance, kind of if then that kind of system, because they want to know that what they're doing is right. And I think this is an important thing for educators to hear, and probably administrators to hear as well, who also are educators. But I think it's important to hear that there's not necessarily always like a quote unquote right response and a quote unquote wrong response. And teachers, we've talked about this before, generally speaking, the go-to personality of a lot of teachers is that they want to they're pretty good at understanding things that are like right, wrong. Like, I teach reading this way, I follow these rules, and then like a kid learns how to read, and like that's great. And like in a lot of ways that works in education. In some ways it does not, right? And so I think there's always the concern of, well, what are other people going to think of me? Or am I doing the right thing? Did I do the right thing in this situation? And you don't have to worry about that if you're following a system that's, if this happens, you do this. If this happens, you do this. But I would encourage people to lean into the freedom of not doing that, not asking for those kind of systems, those kind of flow charts, those zero tolerance, because it not only strips you of your power, but it also doesn't mean that you're right or wrong. Like, if what you choose, like, and ultimately, if you're taking the student's best interest in mind, then you're doing the right thing, right? So it doesn't matter if somebody else next door or two doors down thinks you did the right thing or not, because you actually know all of the situation. And that's hard. That's hard to do as any human.
Yeah, I was just thinking that you're assuming that someone's walking in as the same person every single day.
Yeah.
And some days you're tired. Some days there's maybe some toxic stress going at home. Some days, so you're walking in, you're assuming everyone's baseline is the same every single day, and that we should expect 100% looks the same for everybody every day. And we know that's not true.
Sure.
Even for us.
Oh yeah, for everybody.
Show grace for kids and for us doesn't mean there's not rules and there's not boundaries and there's not consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
They want people to hear that. We
always want people to hear that. Yeah.
Hear that. There is things that need to be followed through and those kind of things. But we start really looking at kids' individual needs and what does this kid need right now to be successful, instead of what punishment do they need so that they'll learn.
Yeah.
We know that kids don't learn that way. To build new neural pathways, it's that repeated intervention practice and skill and transferring of skills, and have to look at it that way instead of and systems allow us to do that.
Yeah. And we can all fall in the trap, again, us included, of like what kind of discipline or what kind of punishment needs to be in place to make me feel better about the situation. And so that's hard. Again, that's not just somebody else feels that way. That's all of us can feel that way. And so we have to be aware of that natural human instinct to be like, well, I want to feel like something happened or was better. And so I want this thing to go down. I don't know. So slightly off topic, but how do you define success of a system that supports behavior then?
I think it's really positive schools culture. When you have a positive school culture, that means the systems are working. People feel confident. They know what's going on. Kids feel supported. When you see negative school culture and climate, there's a fail in the system somewhere. I think we've experienced this when our system had too much. We were taking on the capacity of what we could do and the level of need. We had a hard time meeting that at one time. And so really looking at those systems and what do we need to do so that we could support what we could support in the building. I think some people have, when the system's overloaded, that creates the negative school culture and climate, because you don't feel like you can run your system, right?
Sure.
Because that's too much. So I would say look at building culture and climate, and understand that ultimately is what will help set up, and it will support kids and families and teachers and administrators when the systems are really well ran.
Yeah, and I just think data is crazy important, right? Mm-hmm. Like tracking data in various ways. I mean, that's going to help you start to understand if what you're doing is effective or if what you're doing is not effective in an objective way, right? So, I mean, one, it's important to track data. If we're not tracking data of various sorts, and not like over the top to where all you're doing all day is tracking things, but if you're not tracking some data, then you're not gonna know. You're going to get caught in the idea of, again, we say this a lot, but like of how it feels recently. How does it feel recently? And that's how it's going overall. Well, that's maybe not always true. And so tracking things like, I mean, and I don't know what it looks like in any individual school, but I mean, you can look at things like, have office referrals changed, right? Like of those after a certain amount of time, like are those lessened? Are we seeing less of those? I mean, that tells you all kinds of things, whether it's, hey, students are just generally doing better. It might tell you that, hey, classroom teachers are feeling more empowered to actually make the decisions themselves. They're not relying on somebody else to come and make the decision or send somebody off to go make the decision. And so I think things like that. Do we have fewer students being suspended, fewer detentions, whatever that might be? if that's something that the school does. And again, I think you kind of mentioned about like even the culture and climate surveys like that are done, like kind of anonymous feedback from staff about how things are going. So it's beyond just how does it seem like it feels, but like what are people saying? Like have that improved? And again, we're not talking like has that improved over the last 3 weeks, right? I mean, that's not that's not important, but like has that improved over the last 2 years? Has that improved over the last 3 years? I mean, because all of this work, I think, is important to remember. One more time, we say it all the time, but this is like years long stuff. It's not like 12 days, 1 quarter, and everything's gonna be solved. You can be making improvements, of course, but there's this idea that this kind of overhaul potentially takes years.
Yeah.
You know?
And if you're interested in doing those building culture and climate surveys, one thing, just thinking through that, keep them consistent. As much as I have the itch to like change it sometimes, I won't have consistent data points to look at. Yeah. So keep your fall and a spring one and keep the same survey. Even though you're like, that question could be better, look different, you're going to get different results from that, and you're not going to have data points to look at that. So I encourage you not to send a new survey out every year. Make it the same survey if you're going to be somewhere for a year's time to do that. Yeah. The other thing I was thinking of was I'm going to put a plug out for our friend Allie. Yeah. Our friend Allie Masters is on the School Wellness Podcast. And I was listening to that last night. It just came out. And Allie talks pretty extensively about school data and how data has informed decisions at a former school she was working at. Yep. And so if people really want to hear about some systems and data input, I encourage them to listen to the School Wellness Podcast that Allie's on. And maybe we can have her back to talk through. She loves data, so that would be a good podcast to have her come back.
Well, and again, I think it's because it's useful. If you're using it well, and you're taking the time to make sure it's collected well and things like that, then that can be an incredibly useful tool. Otherwise, you're kind of floating out there just in how things feel, and that can be pretty tough. All right, so what are some examples of systems, and how can you create buy-in to those systems?
I'm going to give just some examples. Is that okay?
Okay. I think that's what I asked.
Okay, well,
what are some examples?
I'm nailing it right now. Okay, so, the student isn't responding to Tier 1 PBIS in the classroom, right? We bring classroom data to Tier 2. We put a research-based intervention in place that includes input from the child to build self-efficacy. That's a pretty low-level system that we would have in place. We'd have a forum in terms of the school has a scheduled meeting. We have the right stakeholders at place. We have some access to research-based practices. We dive into the data a little bit more to figure out what the right intervention is going to be by using some research-based surveys or input from the kid, and then we execute that and run that data cycle. That's a behavior system in place. Then I also have maybe a more extreme one. Like a kid runs out of the room, the teacher notifies the team on the radio. If any available adults could look for the child, the communication happens quickly, and the child's located. The restorative conversations happen. The expectations and consequences are delivered with a regulated child. Things are documented and all parties are communicated with. That's a more extreme system, but right, if you have those systems in place, then that doesn't become a really, really big ordeal because there's no problem. We know exactly what to do right now. We can't find a kid. Yeah. We're going to radio. We're going to have the team look. It could all be pretty much wrapped up in 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
I think the system in place.
Yeah. Communication is such a big key to any of this, right? Because I think what we hear a lot from all different sorts of people is that I send a kid, our system is, what we hear. Our system is we send a kid to the office because they ran out of the room. We eventually find them, or we call the office. Somebody in the office finds them. Somebody in the office talks to this kid. 35 minutes later, this kid's back in class, sitting down. I don't know what happened as a teacher, and it's not really communicated with me. And I'm nervous the kid's going to run out of the room again. The kid still seems antsy and doesn't seem ready to be back in, and that's it. Like that's a system. Well, it sounds harsh, but that's a system a lot of places. Yeah. That would be like the closest thing to a system that a lot of places have got going. And I think that the idea of communication, even if many of the things stayed the same in that kind of system, which probably wouldn't be great, but even if they did, adding in a lot of communication back and forth between whoever is working with a kid and the classroom teacher would be wildly important. Now, again, really what needs to happen is a team needs to sit down and work through stuff and again, a conversation with the kid, with the teacher, with whoever,
Yeah.
like all those things need to really happen, like you
Yeah.
said, but so many places there's just somebody who's off somewhere making a decision, hanging out with a kid for a while, doing something. We don't know what that is, doing something with them for a while. And then the kid just shows back up in class. We hear that so often, but I think people struggle to know what to do instead. Or the reality is, I think like we struggle to find the time to do it, to like have those important conversations about what needs to happen or what did happen. Hey, what did happen? Why did it happen? What can we do to prevent it from happening in the future? The kids involved, in some of this and things like that. Those are the systems that we hear about, honestly, the most, I feel like, are things kind of like that.
Yeah, yes, I would say that's consistently as we're out talking to people out when we go places to present or whatever, we hear that a lot. Like, I'm not sure what to do. The kid destroyed my room. What am I supposed to do with the other kids when I'm sitting there? Those are more extreme things. And I think we both would say that seems, you're right, that seems crazy. Like,
that seems like a lot.
I can't believe that's happening. I would agree that's a lot, but it comes back to, honestly, it goes to the base of people understanding what to do, having the right training, putting those systems in place. Something happening once, how are we going to prevent it from happening twice? And are we really looking at the kids' holistic needs? Because some of those behaviors are fight or flight, which means it's really a response, right? And then we have to look through, why is the kid in fight or flight mode? And how do we start seeing some precipitating factors to kind of get ahead of it, so we're not forcing the kid. I think you're really good at this, not forcing the kid to sit in the 80-minute block of class. If we notice at 60 minutes this is where their stamina or capacity is, then we just need to say, okay, at this time we're going to come back and we're going to do a break. We're going to have some quiet time before we enter your next class block, right? Yeah. And those are okay, but you have to come to a place where everybody's okay with that.
Yeah.
Because we don't want the kid clearing the room. We don't want those kind of things, but we can't push kids beyond their capacity. We can work on building up their stamina for those things. But I think that's really important.
Yeah, and so it goes to how are you creating buy-in, right? I think part of that is training and ensuring understanding of staff. Like they have to not just be trained. Like it's fine to train people, and that's good, but you also have to have some kind of way of understanding if they are actually getting it, and in an open forum, because sometimes we get into this. We have a whole episode on how to present professional development, right? A lot of places are really good at just being like talking at you, and then there's no real conversation about it, or freedom to express doubts, or freedom to question if this system will work, or freedom to. You have to be able to have open, honest conversation where people feel like they're being heard, and also being trained at the same time. Because if you don't have that open, honest conversation and people are expressing doubts, you can't dispel myths, which is also a huge deal, right? Like we heard, which is why we say it so often on here. People probably get tired of hearing it, but like one of the biggest myths is like, well, there's no consequences. There's no boundaries. Kids can do whatever they want. That's why we say it so often on here that that's not the case, and that there has to be consequences and boundaries.
It's part
for
of the
actions.
system,
yeah,
right?
Like that's part of the system. But what does that look like? And you have to dispel that myth over and over again. And then I think also buy-in happens more and more when people lead by example. So you have to have some people that are doing this and showing that it can work, whether that's through data points, whether it's through just kind of the eye test, right? Like, hey, it seems like this is improving. And we didn't do that by suspension, office. Like that's not how we did it. We did it a different way by, conversations and taking the time to like have these kind of restorative conversations with students and with adults at the same time. And I think when that happens, I think we've both seen at times, and I've seen at various places, that people start becoming curious why it's working. They're like, well, why does this kid do this for you? Or why does this kid do this for that teacher? Or why does this kid, and that's when you can start being like, oh, it's interesting. I think it's because of this. Like they've done these kind of things, and you can start answering those questions. And if you're out there and you're thinking, I don't know, like it's fine when we're talking about training, but I'm not equipped to train, because that's a lot of people too. Like a lot of people aren't going to feel equipped to train.
100%.
Yeah, and that's understandable. One, I think you can start building your own understanding of different systems that can be put in place. But we also had an episode out, probably it was a long time ago now, on things we've been trained in. that we would recommend, and why. You can go find that one. It's episode something.
Yeah.
And I thought you memorized every episode.
No.
You spouted one off earlier, and I was really impressed that you're like, it's like episode 11. I'm like, how do you know that?
Not as sharp as I once was.
But we have more episodes out now. But we have one out there, and I think go listen to that. Like, and start somewhere, because if you keep not starting, then nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah, and I think we've had Guy Stevens on talk about his reframing behavior. There's a great, if you're not even comfortable leading that, I mean, get your district to invest in some of those things that we've had people on here. Joe Brummer and Margaret Thorsborn's book about trauma, creating trauma-informed responsive schools and educators. That's a good foundational place to start. I think minimum start just PBIS. PBIS is a response to restraint and seclusion interventions. I think we have an episode out on PBIS and cautions, right? Because we're not, giving kids candy every time they do something. That's not the intent of PBIS.
Sure.
But look, I think at the foundation, look at your classroom PBIS, school-wide PBIS systems. Those are, I think, a comfortable place for a lot of places to start, because people have been informed and understand a little bit more about those. So
Dr. Ross Green was on, right?
Dr. Ross Green's crowd platform.
Such
PBS
a good
model.
one. Such a good one to go get trained in that. Again, there's so many, but yeah, I just think that listen to somebody, not just solely us. Like, go listen to the people we listen to, and get trained and start learning some of this stuff. I think that's important. All right. What do you want people to walk away knowing from this episode?
I would say if you want behavior to work in your building, it's about developing a tiered behavior plan that ultimately takes time. So go slow. I think Justin said this. It's going to take years in the making. Build the PD. Start at the beginning. Collective community feedback is essential, and systems create confidence with school culture.
Yeah. I just think still it's super important to remember that the person that's most equipped to probably carry out what needs to be done in a situation is the classroom teacher, or the person that is right there involved the most, that has the best, most knowledge, the best relationship with the kid, which should be the classroom teacher, just because of amount of time spent with each other, right? And I think every step away that we get from that classroom teacher's involvement is a step closer to somebody that's just going to be prescriptive, with a reaction or a consequence, and that it's empowering. Like, so if you're the administrator, be willing to not micromanage how every single behavior or whatever is handled. And if you're a teacher, be willing to take on that responsibility and believe in yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, you can do it. You've got a lot of people that are listening probably have a lot of experience. If you don't, and you're newer and you're I don't really know what to do, I'd ask other teachers that do have a lot of experience and get their insight. And I think that's helpful. I think tap into that, right?
Yeah.
Learn from people.
Don't underestimate the power of relational currency.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've got it.
Well, as always, we really appreciate you guys listening and just joining in the conversation with us. If this is something that was helpful to you, we'd love to hear that. If you're I think you're off base, we also want to hear that too, believe it or not. So stay in communication with us, stay in the conversation with us. We love that. And if you think this is an episode that would be helpful for somebody to hear and could encourage somebody in some way, or could help maybe spur on a little bit of change, or for your school, your district to start something when you need to start, then I would say share it out, and keep that conversation going in your own circles. That's super important.
Yeah.
And as always, let's go out and do the work.
Let's go do it.
Hey everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.